I'm still waiting, Bharat, for the file to come.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You know what? Like since I have the backup here, I can just run it and I think it'll be fine. I think we will muddle through somehow and it'll be okay.
I am sure it will be okay. All right, I think we're going to get started. And if in the meantime the file arrives, I will be happy to run it. But
Cool.
I'm absolutely delighted to welcome as our final speaker in our Summer Research Institute, Dr. Bharat Venkat, who is assistant professor in the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA. He is the author of a book in 2021 called At the Limits of Cure, which explores the treatment of tuberculosis in India, a really rich and important subject. And for his book, he was awarded the Joseph Elder Prize in the Indian Social Sciences. He's now at work on a project exploring what he calls thermal inequality, which studies the nexus between environmental change and racial and social inequality. And as he showed in the LA Times op-ed that he sent on for us to review in advance of this this session, which I encourage you to look at in greater detail after, there's an interesting but not altogether surprising correlation between an environment, or I should say, there's this correlation between the following factors that make for a state of thermal inequality. Greater degrees of concrete, less grass, a higher proportion of people of color, and a higher rate of health risks. Those elements together make for an environment of thermal inequality. And it's no surprise, therefore, that Dr. Venkat is the director of the UCLA Heat Lab, which I believe, I'm led to believe, explores this precise set of variables that together make up for a state of thermal inequality. Yes, and we have a fan of the Heat Lab already with us. Thank you, Natalie. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Dr. Venkat as we move towards the culmination of our time together and see the possibilities of merging textured historical research and serious thinking about how policy might be modified and recalibrated in light of nuanced historical research. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Venkat, and it's really a delight to welcome you here as a first-time participant in the Summer Research Institute.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you both, David and Rose, and thanks to all of you for showing up and making the time, especially in the middle of your summer. I think I'm the last presenter, right? So
You are.
I'll try to keep it entertaining, keep you awake a little bit, if I can, as best as I
I
can.
should just say, Bharat, your PowerPoint has arrived. So if you'd like to take it down, I can.
I think I'm okay.
Okay.
Can everyone see my slides and just the slides, not the notes? Okay, fantastic. So I'm gonna go ahead and try this out. I haven't done Zoom in a while. It's been a bit of back into real world teaching, and so I'm trying to relearn very quickly how I did this on Zoom a year ago. But if things go haywire, please just let me know. You're welcome to just unmute yourself and speak or raise your hand and let me know something's weird. So I wanted to give you a bit of background. Well, so my talk today is called Towards Thermal Justice, Studying the History of Heat for the Present. My name again is Bharat Venkat. I have a PhD in cultural and medical anthropology, but at UCLA, I have appointments across 3 departments, and this is kind of important for what I'm going to talk about today. One is the Institute for Society and Genetics, which is in the life sciences. So we study really interesting emergent problems at the interface of biology and society. My other 2 appointments are more North Campusy, social sciences, humanities, and that's history and anthropology. And so that means I work across fields and I try to think about how I can bring to bear the methodological tools, insights, resources from multiple fields to answer these really complicated questions and to figure out how we can approach them. Right? So I'm going to, okay, so for today, I have three major goals. First, I want to tell you about why I study. So why did I come to study heat? What have I learned? Why does that matter to me? Secondly, what are the methods I've used? Specifically, what are the kinds of historical methods I've brought to bear to think about this problem of heat? And thirdly, how can history come to inform the present, and specifically, how can it come to inform policy? I'm a firm believer that historical research is really important to helping us better shape the present into the world we want to see, but I also don't believe that simply producing knowledge is enough. It requires work of translation and communication, which I think you probably talked about over the last couple of days, but simply learning something new isn't going to produce change in the present. You have to do the work to kind of make that available to others, especially those who might have the capacity to produce those changes. So I'll talk a bit about how I try to do that. And it's very much a work in progress, something that I'm still learning, something that I didn't learn in graduate school, something that I had to kind of teach myself and to go to those who've done it really well and ask them, how do you do this? How do you make historical research speak to the present in a way that is efficacious, right? So let me go ahead and start by telling you how I began this work. So, and again, feel free at any point to jump in. If you have a question, you can just raise your hand or just interrupt me. I really don't mind. I kind of like it. So, so in the summer of 2015, I was finishing up fieldwork in India for my first book, which is about tuberculosis treatment in India and why it's so hard to get cured and stay cured. I traveled across Delhi to hospitals and clinics where I've been doing my research. In the midst of what turned out to be a massive heat wave, that resulted in at least 2,500 deaths, although that number is probably an underestimate. The true count's probably much higher, but it's quite hard to determine cause of death related to heat. But you know, kind of like an intrepid field worker, and also because I was a little bit naive, a little bit stupid, I kind of ignored the heat. I just decided to go ahead, jump in an auto, get to where I was going, jump in the metro, then walk a bit. I thought to myself, you know, it seems hot, it seems bad, but you know, isn't it always kind of bad? It's India, it's hot. I just need to kind of push through. And then I get to the hospital and it's closed, right? So I get to the hospital and all the doctors who showed up to work that day are hiding out in the on-call room with the one room which has air conditioning. They've sent the patients home. No one's doing anything. And it kind of struck me, you know, I just thought to myself, well, it's hot, but it's the summer in Delhi. Of course, it's hot. But it was actually too hot, right? Everyday life had been totally turned around by the heat. What people wore, when they went out, what they drank, what they ate, where they were going when they went there, all of that was being re-circumscribed by the thermal conditions of the day. And this got me thinking about how important heat is, both in kind of ordinary everyday circumstances, but also under these really extreme conditions. Something that should have been really obvious, but for some reason I was just really unable to process, right? So case in point, these are images from the NASA Landsat satellite. This is an invaluable source of climate-related data. The images are of Purul Lake, which is the main rain-fed reservoir in the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu, where I do a lot of my research. The photo on the left, yeah, it should be your left as well as mine, is from May 31st, 2018. The one on the right is from June 19th, 2019. So almost exactly 1 year apart. What this image shows you is that the effects of extreme heat are already present, they're already serious, and they're compounded by failures in the monsoon. So in fact, according to a recent study, there have been over 700 heat waves in India over the last 50 years, which have taken more than 17,000 lives in total, right? So this kind of thing makes you realize this is not something that is just started last year or just started in 2015. This is not something that is just kind of on the way up. This is already a serious here and now kind of problem, but one that has a history that needs to be kind of understood to kind of think about how did this come to consciousness? Why are we only kind of starting to address it now? How we not kind of realized how serious the problem is? And a lot of this has to do with how we think about what counts as a heat wave, what counts as a heat-related death, which are really difficult things to determine and things that have changed over time. So, I moved to UCLA in 2019 to my current position, where I began to experience heat waves like all of you, like clockwork every summer. We're experiencing heat waves now in Southern California and across much of the United States. I think right now the Southeast is experiencing a ton of really high temperatures. You're seeing it in the UK right now as well. Heat waves are not exceptional; they are now the rule. And so this motivated me to consider how I could study heat as a trans-regional and comparative phenomenon, but one that was not evenly distributed. And I want to signal right away, going back to these images, that we're already thinking here in terms of the realm of history, and especially recent history, right? So satellite imagery, climatological data, these are really important sources for understanding the recent past, right? So they're not the same, say, looking at a 200-year-old document and thinking about what someone was trying to, to describe in like really difficult to read penmanship, right? But these are also important sources of data to both understand what's happened in the recent past, but also to understand how people were thinking about it. So how did they produce this kind of data? Why did they focus on specific parts of the world? Why did they use certain kinds of resolutions? What could this tell us? What couldn't this tell us? So thinking about the conditions of production of all of these kinds of historical forms of data that are publicly available. You can look online and find all of the kind of NASA Landsat satellite data and think about how that informs climate policy in the present. Right? All right. Did I switch the right slide? Yep. All right, so there are two kind of key organizing concepts that drive my work. The first is thermal experience, which refers to how we subjectively or phenomenologically experience heat. That is, how does heat affect how we think about it? How do we talk about it? How do we respond to it? This is really distinct from the more usual quantitative metrics that you might see. So, if you look at your phone, it'll tell you the temperature. You could go online, find humidity data. You could look at heat index with global temperatures. That doesn't tell you a lot, though, about how people experience heat, how they respond to it, what they do in it. You might see a number. Does that number mean you should not go hiking today? Does that mean that you should stay out of the you should stay inside midday? Like, how do you translate that into the way in which you experience and move through the world, right? How does going out in the world change when you feel like the sun is right above you, when you're sweating, or when it feels like it's a dry heat? How are we able to kind of perceive and organize our days in relationship to that experience of heat? The second kind of driving concept is thermal inequality, which refers to the fact that some people are more affected by heat than others. Of course, it matters that some places are simply hotter than others. For example, Delhi is hotter than London or hotter than Los Angeles. But it also matters, it's not just simply about climatological circumstance, about geography. It's also about who has, for example, access to air conditioning, who has to work outside or in a really hot warehouse, who has to wait at a bus standing out in the sun, who, in other words, is more likely to suffer adverse health effects from heat, who is more likely to be hospitalized or have access to appropriate health care, right? So my aim in this research is to understand how certain kinds of people and certain kinds of bodies and communities have been actively made more vulnerable to the effects of heat, and what we can do about that, right? So what are the kinds of changes we can make? What are the kinds of policy differences that can happen to make that not the case? I'm having a lovely time moving through pieces of paper trying to figure out what slide I'm on. There we go. So one image I always like to think about is this one. So this is an image of a pankavala, or a fan puller from colonial India. Here, what you can see is that Indian workers were made to work the fans so that British families, administrators, soldiers, so on and so forth, could enjoy the kind of relative cool inside. So you can see folks here literally using their feet, their hands to pull these fans that are inside of the house and keeping the inside of the house cool, right? So the reason why I like this image is that it provides a kind of key insight about thermal comfort and how thermal comfort for some is purchased at the expense of others. And this is not just something that happened in the past. We can think about our own lives. For example, if you go and buy strawberries or other produce from the store, you can only do that because other people, usually migrant workers from Central and South America, are asked to work in the hot fields, right? So in this way, like, your comfort, your pleasure, your ability to kind of eat these certain kinds of foods is purchased at the expense of others' thermal comfort. Another important and kind of under-examined aspect of thermal inequality are these downstream effects that don't at first glance seem to be heat related, but are nevertheless really tied to heat in a fundamental way. So here in this kind of horrific image, you see Aedes aegypti, which is a vector for Zika, chikungunya, yellow fever, and dengue. As certain parts of the world get warmer, the geographic range of these mosquitoes is changing. So infectious disease becomes a possible consequence of increasing temperatures, but not to everyone and not to the same degree. So an important thing to keep in mind here, again, thinking historically, is that our epidemiological landscapes are changing themselves. So the question of where disease is located is transforming as our climate changes. So many of these diseases that I mentioned, chikungunya, yellow fever, Zika, dengue, were thought to be what were called tropical diseases. So much so that you had entire institutions that were developed to study these tropical diseases, right? And the idea was that, if you can study tropical diseases, you can help protect primarily white, British, French, Portuguese bodies that are in the tropics, make sure that they're safe. And the reason you want them to be safe is because you want to hold on to the colonial empire, right? So the kind of impetus of this kind of medicine was to kind of keep empire intact. The kind of grand irony now is that these diseases, these mosquitoes, are now becoming endemic to places like France, Portugal, England, right? So the very centers of empire, these temperate, non-tropical centers, have now become, in a kind of weird way, part of the tropics. The tropics actually somehow spread, and now you have tropical diseases in these places that were thought to be temperate, mild, and so on, right? So let me tell you a bit, kind of give you an overview of my research in India and what I'm trying to do there. So I have funding from the National Science Foundation to conduct research in India, which combines ethnographic work, cartographic work with maps and producing maps, and historical methods to understand how heat became a problem in India, how people came to understand heat and adapt to heat, and why it's so difficult to adapt to heat, both in the colonial era and after Indian independence from the British in 1947. Now, this is a really difficult thing to do because everybody understands heat a little bit differently. You have on one hand experts, right? You have elite, you have government bureaucrats, you have architects, botanists, surgeons, city planners, engineers. These folks all leave records in archives, in official archives, and you can go and read them, oftentimes in English, to understand how they're thinking about how does heat affect city planning? How does it affect how we build homes? How does it affect how we think about taxation and farming and so on and so forth? What's more difficult is accessing non-elite voices. So how do ordinary everyday people, farmers, construction workers, agricultural workers, merchants, how do all these folks understand heat? How did they adapt to it? How were they thinking about it during this period in which heat was thought to be a big problem for, again, white colonists, but less so for brown bodies? And the way I've been doing that is looking at these same sources and doing what's called reading against the grain, right? So for example, if I see a medical report about brown Indian patients and what's happening to them in India, I can use that to understand something about the patient experience themselves. So how can I read against the grain of that source to kind of think about what is that person's experience? Where are they coming from? How are they kind of interacting with the doctor here? How can I kind of read against the intent of the person who's producing this record, right? The other way to do this is to kind of look at vernacular sources. So in other words, non-English sources, things like magazines, letters, newspapers, even receipts or other kinds of scraps that give you a sense of how ordinary people understood and responded to heat, right? These can be a lot harder to get, as expected in most places. The people who tend to leave records behind are those who are the most elite, right? Those who might have access to literature, to literacy, to English, if not a vernacular kind of written form of language. But nevertheless, there are ways you can access these sources. And these are really important because they help you to understand not just how experts think about these kinds of problems, but how ordinary people kind of respond to and deal with heat, right? Of course, I was also really interested in how these ideas circulated. So how, elite ideas came to circulate amongst ordinary folks and vice versa. And so kind of tracking the movement of different ideas about heat. The other piece of this is oral history, right? So talking to folks now about how they responded to heat, what changes they've seen in the urban environment, how that's affected what they can do and what they can't do, right? So for this work, I'm talking to kind of three large groups. The urban poor, so those who tend to work outside, have limited access to climate control. The middle class, those who are, say, working in offices, who are able to, have air conditioning at home, air conditioning in their car, and air conditioning when they get to their office. And then those experts who work to shape our collective climate. And this is really helpful for a couple of reasons. One, it really helps to understand the last 50 to 80 years. So the kind of time period when the archives will be less useful. So it helps to kind of fill a gap in recent history. Secondly, it helps us to kind of get an understanding of how, especially ordinary people, talk about and understand heat in terms of kind of locally salient kind of idioms, right? So to kind of give you an example, if you go up to somebody and ask them, how do you think about heat, or how do you respond to heat? It's a question most people can't really respond to. They don't really know what to say. They're like, yeah, it gets hot. I try to stay inside, or it's not something that people have a strong memory with. It's a little bit difficult to kind of articulate stories or histories around that. However, heat is such a kind of critical concept across multiple domains that people often think about heat in terms of, say, illness or medicine, right? So in Ayurveda, Siddha, and in other forms of Indian traditional medicine, you have this idea of hot and cold bodies, hot and cold foods, right? And they're not exactly the same as climatic heat and cold, but you can use that as a way to talk about heat, right? So when you feel like your body is hot and you're getting sick, what kinds of foods do you eat or drink, right? How does that relate to what's going on climatologically? How does that relate to how you organize your house, or whether you go outside, what kinds of activities you do, what kinds of uh, maybe faith-based rituals you would engage in, or which ones you would avoid because of your body becoming too hot or too cold, right? So there are ways in which you can kind of come to ask these questions that depend on understanding local histories, local idioms. Because if you just simply ask, how do you experience heat? You're not going to get a very good answer. And so one of the things I learned very early on is that it's really important to learn how to ask questions. And you're not going to have a single kind of, and this is kind of also why questionnaires tend to fail a lot. Because when you build a questionnaire without actually being situated in a context, you're not asking questions in a way that produce interesting answers, right? So you have to understand, how do people actually talk about these things? What are the kind of salient, relevant ways to frame a question? So why does all of this matter to the present? There's a few kind of key reasons. The first is that government planning in India and many places around the world has really focused on elite knowledge about climate. So for example, those satellite images I showed you earlier, rather than how ordinary people actually understand, experience, and respond to heat. So what that means is that, if you have a climate plan to make a city cooler or warmer, help people out, but you don't know anything about how people actually navigate heat, how they use air conditioning or don't use air conditioning, or have it or don't have it, or where they have to work, or, even if someone lives in, say, in a cooler neighborhood, but they work in a hotter one, if you don't understand daily practice, if you don't understand how things came to be the way they are, then you won't be able to really respond to the kind of thermal inequality baked into cities. And this is very clear when it comes to things like race and class and caste, right? In India, you have a strong idea that certain kinds of people are more vulnerable to the effects of heat than others. And this is a kind of long-standing problem. There's a kind of racialized and caste-based idea of kind of biological vulnerability or resilience. And so that means that certain people, you might say somebody from the northeast of India is more able to stand outside working as a guard or a watchman in the heat for 8 hours. And you'll think, oh, that's totally fine. And you won't understand that that's the problem, because you have this idea that there's a relationship between race and resilience, right? And this is an idea that's not only in India, it kind of haunts labor regimes across the world. I'll talk about that a bit later on. The second is that heat-related illnesses can seem invisible in contemporary India because of the fact that it's so hot, right? Partially it's that, it's always hot, so it's hard to kind of determine when is heat actually leading to illness. But the other part of it has to do with the stories we tell, the historical stories. So one of the big stories in kind of the history of medicine in India over the last 50, 60, 70 years has been one of an epidemiological transition, right? So the idea is that, before, in the kind of before times, people died from infectious disease, right? In the present times, there was a kind of shift, right? Probably in the mid-late 20th century, where people started dying from what are called lifestyle diseases, right? Things like heart disease, right? For example. What that means is that climate kind of disappears as a possible cause of illness. So when someone shows up in the hospital and they're showing certain symptoms, the doctor will think this is heart disease, not think this is heat related. And those things often kind of work together, which makes it even more complicated. So when I talk to doctors today, they say to me, yeah, like it's true, we have all these heat waves, and yet I never see heat related illness in the hospital, right? So how is that possible? And how does that then demand a kind of rethinking of how medicine, public health works in places that are tropical, the places that are always hot, where heat illness can be really easily kind of overlooked, right? The third is these persistent ideas about racialized and ethnic difference and vulnerability to heat. And I want to show you what I mean through this video. I'm hoping this will work. So let's just see real quick. All right, so I don't know if you've seen this video, but it's very short. I'm just going to play it for you right now.
If we're supposed to hear sound, I'm not hearing sound.
There is the sound is basically this band playing, but you don't really nobody's talking, so it's not too important.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah. So what you're watching here is from June 10th, I believe, and this is a military parade in honor of Prince William. Temperatures passed about 30 degrees Celsius, about 86 Fahrenheit. And a couple of soldiers started fainting, right? So 86 degrees doesn't seem that hot to us, probably for most of us, at least not hot enough to cause fainting. But this led to a series of really kind of tongue-in-cheek posts on social media, people saying, how in the hell did the British colonize the majority of the tropical world when they can't even like play the trombone or whatever in 86-degree heat? Like, this is kind of ridiculous, right? Now, the funny thing is, when I saw this, last summer there was a heat wave in Britain as well, and people were saying the same thing. They were saying like the British folks are fainting, dying. How in the hell could they possibly die from 86-degree weather and yet somehow like colonize much of the tropical world? Doesn't make any sense. So I wrote about it. I wrote an article about the history of race and racialized thinking related to kind of thermal vulnerability, and I decided to kind of post about it, right? So I tried to kind of explain, why is this question not really the right way of thinking about this? How are people vulnerable in different ways? What is the kind of racialized underpinning of this? So we kind of assume that the British must have been more resilient to take over these parts of the world, but in fact, there was always this concern about white vulnerability, the idea that white-skinned folks were more vulnerable to the effects of heat, and therefore these tropical holdings were always precarious. The flip side of this logic was that brown and black bodies were totally tolerant to heat. And what that means is that when it comes to hard labor in the sun, those are the bodies that should be doing that work. And this logic also underpins the history of indentured labor, the history of slavery in the Americas, right? The idea that Black bodies are the ones that should be kind of working in the fields. White bodies should be overseeing that from a veranda or wearing a hat or somewhere else that's cooler, right? So this kind of entire regime of labor premised on extraction from some and slavery and indenture has a kind of thermal logic underpinning it, right? All the way from India to North America. And I tried to kind of point that out to kind of say, these questions about how did the British do this, or, shouldn't we be more able to deal with this, really doesn't kind of understand this longer history of racialized thinking that, that very much, encircles both kind of white British bodies right now and kind of Indian, Black, Indigenous bodies over the last like 200-300 years, right? And this, to my mind, is one way to engage in serious conversations in the present to help shape debates, to help shape policy, is to do something as simple as entering into these social media spaces and saying, hey, how can I bring scholarship to bear? How can I bring historical knowledge to bear on how we understand what's going on in the present and how it's been shaped by the past, and what we can do about that, right? So how can we reshape ideas about racialized vulnerability in the present that are still affecting, who does what kind of work? So I want to turn now to my work in the US. So in early 2020, I founded the UCLA Heat Lab, which is a group of about 20 students, give or take, who've taken on a variety of projects focused on heat from an interdisciplinary perspective. These projects have evolved out of a combination of my own interest in climate, heat, health, and the interest of my students in the lab. And I want to take you through a quick fire exercise, which is really a compressed form of what we do in the heat lab. So, as I mentioned, the students in the lab, they develop their own projects. So when they ask me, what should I study? What should I work on? I'm actually pretty open to what the answer might be. I don't give them an answer. I just say, as long as it's heat related, it works for me, right? So I always begin by asking them, what are you curious about? What are you interested in? What are you invested and excited about that you could imagine working on over time? What will you feel less like work and more like something that you're passionate about or that you're enjoying? And so what I want to ask you to do now is, sorry, I see something in the chat. Oh, okay, great. Thank you for the link. So I want you to take about 2 minutes right now and just brainstorm and think about 3 ideas, very quickly. It can literally be anything. Don't worry too much right now, whether it's policy related or not. Think about 3 things that you're really passionate about, that you're excited about, you're curious about. I recommend combinations. So the example I give you is sports plus heat, right? So 2 things I'm excited about or interested in are some kinds of sports and climate and heat, right? So I combine those. So I want you to just take 2 minutes and just think about these kinds of combinations. It can be anything from comic books to running to how printers work, whatever, right? So think about the kind of vast expanse of things. Don't worry too much whether it's relevant or important, and just think about 3 quick ideas, right? So go ahead and do that right now. I'll give you all about 2 minutes. So as you're kind of thinking and writing, if folks could maybe share some of their ideas in the chat, so we can kind of think about what other folks are thinking about, where their heads are taking them. You can throw in one idea or a couple of ideas. And it doesn't have to be about heat, it can be about anything, right? So you can combine gender and comic books, right? It can be literally anything, right? So we see immigration in video games, that's awesome. Queer urban city spaces and heat. I love the creativity, right? So there's so many possibilities of things. Minorities and mental health. Sometimes the most random combinations are the most interesting because they're things that we don't expect to be in relationships somehow. Music preferences, sexual behavior. Can we get a couple more? Food storage and heat. Environmental justice, minority rights. Great. Okay. So step 2, I want you to think about what's the kind of data information sources that you need. So another way to put this is what kinds of questions do you need answered to begin to answer your question, right? So give you an example of, so if in the first case I said to you sports plus heat, right? So one possible question I could be curious about is how did athletes adjust to playing in different climates before we knew about climate change? So don't worry too much yet about how you'll find the answer or where you'll look, but just think about, for two of your possible topics, what are the kinds of questions or the kinds of data or information you might need? It could be, for example, um a list of addresses. It could be a list of place names. It could be a set of historical maps. It could be um, artifacts. It could be, for example, so I see clothing. You could, look at historical clothing in a particular area, right? So what are the kinds of things you might, just kind of brainstorming wildly, need to begin to think about these topics? So take 2 minutes and just think about that. And you can start throwing ideas into the chat as well. So please start throwing those into the chat so we can kind of see what are the kinds of data information sources you might be looking for to begin to answer your question. So I see here a great comment about a set of questions about video games. And this is great, right? So you might imagine that your archive in this case is going to be video games. You need to go find a collection of video games searching back over the last 40 years. So you can actually play them and see how they've changed over time, right? That can be an archive. That can be an incredible resource. Other folks. Can we get one or two other kinds of ideas about the kinds of sources you might use? Okay, so we have how have career spaces in major metropolitan areas changed over the change over the past 50-ish years as a result of climate change effects in cities? Great. So you could look at, for example, a map of gay bars, right? So you could basically look at cities like New York, San Francisco, and create a kind of map looking at historical data about businesses that have been registered, and think about, okay, well, this is a resource to understand how gay bars have changed, or there's been more, there's been less, they've been located in specific places. How different language vocabulary is developed based on the historical heat patterns present in the region. Yes, you could look at histories of kind of language use. You could look at books or other textual sources. Physicians diagnosed, talked about, and quoted symptoms of heat-related illness. Yeah, so you can look at diagnostic manuals, how those have changed over time. Great. So what we're seeing is this kind of bevy of possible resources, bevy of possible questions that people need to kind of answer. And this takes us to kind of the next part, which is how might you get those? Where might you find them? Right. So the example I give here is that maybe I would look at sports archives. Maybe I would look at maybe I would do oral histories with athletes and coaches. Maybe there's publicly available data. Maybe critically, I would ask people who know things. This is a really undervalued way of doing research, is that if there are people who know things, and it sounds silly to say, but experts are experts for a reason, right? So if, for example, you're interested in studying, let's take the video game example, right? There are people who are scholars of video games. So instead of inventing it from scratch, you would email them and say, hey, scholar of video game, can you tell me where I can find an archive of video games that I can kind of play through to figure out how gender, immigration, or violence plays out in these games, right? So turning to people who can guide you to the in those right directions is an incredibly kind of valuable way of finding useful resources, finding data, finding information, right? I'm going to jump real quick to the very last part of this because I think we've kind of covered 2 and 3 already, which is how do you want to communicate your findings and to whom? So this is where the policy relevance comes into play, right? What kind of change do you want to see in the world? So here, to give you an example, right? So one thing we've thought about in the lab is how does heat affect UCLA student athletes, right? How does the fact that it's getting hotter affect their ability to acclimatize when they have to, say, travel from Los Angeles to somewhere hotter, somewhere colder, and then play the next day? Do they have enough time to really adjust to those new conditions? Is that good for their, I mean, do they have enough time to adjust to be at peak performance or to remain healthy to avoid heat-related illness, right? So one way we might broadcast our findings and help to kind of shift how athletes are treated is to write an op-ed in the Daily Bruin, right, about longer acclimatization periods for student athletes. So this is a really critical thing. We often think that the end result of research has to be a peer-reviewed paper, and that's kind of the goal, especially if you want to go to graduate school or if you're already an academic. But in fact, there's a variety of ways you might present your work out in the world. You might do a podcast, you might do a zine, you might write an op-ed, you might speak directly to policymakers, you might do a conference with community members, you might do a kind of meeting, you might do a public hearing or a town hall. And we often kind of close off the possibility when we just imagine that the best way to do this is simply the peer-reviewed article, right? So one of the things I have my students do is to kind of ask themselves, who do I want to have this information? Who do I want to share this with? And what's the best way to reach that audience? So I want you to kind of take one of your topics or examples and think about what would be the best way to reach them? What's the best kind of output or mode of communication to get your historical research out into the world, right? So just take about 2 minutes and think about that and throw ideas into the chat. I'm starting to see some answers. Local language TV interviews, absolutely. We often think that bigger is better, right? So if you can be in the New York Times, you could be on CNN, that's the most important thing. But actually, oftentimes to reach a community, it's a lot better if you're able to do something on, say, a local access news channel or a local newspaper or in a local language. I see mini podcast series with oral history interviews, absolutely. An ad in a newspaper, publicly available mapping, social geography projects. A lot of people are doing these amazing kind of digital history projects online. Local NPR stations, great. Radio is really, really important. Opinion columns, social media, Twitter, yes. I mean, you can reach, I guess, literally thousands, if not millions of people now via social media, and that can be an important way to kind of disseminate your work and show how it's relevant to the present. Great. So what you've done now is basically a compressed version of what we do in the lab, often over the course of months, quarters, even years, right? This is how we develop research projects, is we think about what are we interested in, what do we want to kind of really explore and go deep into, Where might we find available sources? Who might we turn to help us do that? And how do we want to disseminate that work, right? That's how we construct a project over time. And I want to kind of show you a little bit about how that's resulted in really specific projects for our lab. So I'm going to focus really quickly on two projects that are both kind of LA based. The first is focused on occupational thermal environments. So in other words, how people experience heat at work. So during the height of the pandemic, for those who were at UCLA, food trucks became a really important source for meals for a lot of UCLA students, because dining halls were either closed down or folks were worried about eating in dining halls in a kind of enclosed space. So my students got really interested in understanding, what is it like to work in a hot metal box, right? So what do those food truck workers and owners go through on a daily basis? These folks who are so integral to feeding students like you, what is their experience like? So my students wanted to understand, first of all, how do we get to this question? How do we understand something about their experience? So their first kind of gambit, or their first attempt, was to use these little buttons that are called I buttons, and they place those throughout the truck to kind of learn how hot it gets in these trucks, right? So they put them near the food prep area, serving window area, and near the hot cooking element. And what they found is it gets over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in parts of these trucks, right? So these truck workers who are working long hours are being exposed to incredibly high temperatures. However, this only kind of gives them the kind of icing on the cake. This tells you how much heat they're being exposed to. But how do they actually experience this heat? What are they thinking about what's going on with them, right? So I'm just going to jump forward here. So the students began doing oral histories and interviews with food truck workers and owners to get a sense of this experience. Workers frequently work either alone or in pairs, so taking a break could be really difficult. They often work several hours in a row without taking breaks. And one food truck worker told us, it gets to the point where you just feel nauseous. And what's happening is that you're forcing yourself to drink water even though you're not thirsty. Your stomach hurts. Sometimes you get sick to your stomach because you're just really, really hot. But other workers spoke to us about the opposite. They said that they were very resilient. They could endure these conditions. And a couple of owners told us that they only hired workers who could, quote, handle the heat, who could take the heat. And when we asked them who that was, we were kind of told repeatedly, it's Black, Latinx, Asian American workers who were thought to be more heat resilient. Meanwhile, white workers were thought to basically faint on the job on day one, right? We even heard this from workers themselves, who would talk about, for example, their Mexican heritage or Indonesian heritage and say, my family is able to deal with this because of our ethnic racial background, so we can kind of deal with working in hot conditions. Now, what's interesting about this is that these ideas about racialized resilience are really old ones, like I just kind of described before, right? This idea that people of color are able to deal with hot conditions and white folks can't. It's not grounded in biology, but it's one that has a kind of long history within the history of biological thinking about race, right? And that continues to shape how people, hire in jobs across, not just food trucks, but the automotive industry, across agriculture in Central California, across, construction, right? So these racialized ideas persist over time. And one of the things that we can kind of do then is think about how do we tell people about this? How do we tell them about the kind of persistence of racialized ideas that have a long history, and show how those ideas, in fact, are pernicious and not necessarily grounded in kind of biological truth per se, right? One way is through op-eds, right? So I wrote this piece that I think was shared with all of you in the LA Times, which was not actually about the food truck workers. It's actually about work we did in Watts. So Watts is a primarily Black and Latinx neighborhood in Los Angeles that was formerly redlined, which means that it is an area that has been kind of historically underinvested in, over-policed. It has placed with a lot of concrete, not a lot of trees, not a lot of shade. And it's about 4.7 degrees hotter, 4.7 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than surrounding areas that are kind of whiter. And Watts is a really unfortunate example of the ways in which thermal inequality works, right? In a way in which this kind of historical disinvestment over decades leads to a space being much hotter than it should be and really impacting poor people of color, right? So this is not simply an effect of location. It's not simply about where Watts is geographically. It's about how Watts has been built up in a certain way and not in others, right? So in Watts, my team and I did oral histories with people who live there to understand a bit about how they live, how the built environment has changed around them. One resident explained that she lived in Jordan Downs, pictured here, which is a public housing complex that they built for workers during World War II, in a unit without air conditioning. So there are currently redevelopment efforts underway to build new units that will have air conditioning. Yet having air conditioning in a home is not enough. What many Watts residents told us was that they were afraid to use AC because they were worried about energy bills. So they said to us, if we use our ACs, like, assuming we had ACs, if we use them, we wouldn't be able to afford things like rent or paying for food or sending our kids to school or hospital bills, right? So they're always making this kind of calculation about what can we afford. And AC can seem like a luxury at certain moments, right? And when I talked to an LA City Council member about this, I said why is it that the city doesn't pay for air conditioning? He said to me, it's really hard because if I talk to the other people on city council, I say, let's pay for air conditioning, they'll say that's a luxury, right? Why should we pay for air conditioning? So there's a sense in which thermal exposure becomes, in some ways, deeply tied to ideas about class and about comfort rather than necessity, right? Rather than ideas about health. It's a very hard sell to explain to somebody that an air conditioner is not just something to make you feel better or more comfortable. It's actually central to your ability to kind of concentrate, to focus, and to stay alive. So I just want to end by talking about this question of thermal justice. What does thermal justice look like for food truck workers or for the residents of Watts? So for food truck workers, it might mean valuing worker safety alongside food safety. It might mean developing new regulations that keep in mind the economic realities of food truck workers and owners. It might mean redesigning food trucks to make them cooler. It might also mean undercutting these long-lasting racialized ideas about heat resilience and vulnerability, right? In Watts, thinking about thermal justice might mean investing in things that don't feel at first glance to be heat related, right? So the reason I wrote that op-ed was because the federal government announced that there was funding available for climate adaptation efforts, right? And the question was, where do we direct these funds? So the argument I made was that these neighborhoods, these communities that have been affected by decades of disinvestment should be the first place where we invest these funds, right? So putting money into communities of color that have been redlined to make sure that they have air conditioning, to make sure that they have trees, to make sure that they have public transportation, to make sure they have all these things that make them cooler is the kind of foremost important way to invest in climate adaptation, right? And so in this sense, to my mind, climate adaptation, thermal justice has to be thought of in terms of economic justice and racial justice, right? These things are really deeply tied together, but you can only kind of get to this by understanding the longer histories that have led to people in places like Watts, or say Mexican or Guatemalan workers in food trucks at UCLA. Understanding those histories helps you understand how they ended up being hotter than other people and why that thermal inequality exists in the first place, right? So, I'm going to go ahead and stop there and just open it up to questions, either about my research on heat in India or in the US, or about the research process or how I kind of use history to think about the present day and kind of help to shape policy in this moment. So yeah, thank you. And if you have questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat or raise your hand.
Thank you. Do you want to, your presentation hasn't gone down yet, Bharat. Do you want to?
Oh, sure.
We already have a question. Yeah. Great.
Oh, hi, Professor Venkat. I was just wondering, based on your research, so have you like been led to conclude that then say in India, the people are there's no biological basis for heat resilience, and it's just more, I guess, clothing and I guess I don't know, shelter adaptation. That's, I suppose, things that they've, I guess, socially created to adapt to the heat. It's more of a curiosity question. So.
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing. There is a limited capacity for humans to acclimatize to different thermal conditions, right? So of course, for example, if you're, say, an athlete or an agricultural worker, if you're working in a hotter place, if you say you're moving from a colder place to a hotter place, over the course of weeks or months, you can acclimatize to a certain degree, right? So you can become more efficient biologically at handling those thermal conditions. However, the problem is there's this kind of powerful racialized biological idea that as kind of larger racial groups, certain people are better able to handle heat than others. And that's patently false, right? So there's no kind of universal racialized capacity for certain people to handle heat better than others. And yet that logic is shapes so much of how we organize labor, not just in the US, but across the world, in terms of who gets funneled into what kinds of jobs, who gets hired in what kinds of positions, and who doesn't, right?
Bharat, we have two questions in the chat from Cynthia and Mariano.
Okay.
First is about the new shade structures at bus stops in LA.
Yeah, so Cynthia writes, what are your thoughts on the recent initiative by LA to install shade structures at bus stops across the city? From what I can see, these structures look practically useless and seem wholly misguided. How do we hold policymakers accountable for initiatives like these, and how can we create public infrastructure that truly makes a difference? This is a great question. So these structures, I think there's only a couple of them right now that are in use. They're basically, you're right, they're pretty useless, right? And part of the problem has to do with the fact that the way bus shelters are funded across Los Angeles is that Los Angeles basically outsources that work, right? So they say to a company, hey, if you pay for the advertising here in this bus stand, you're then allowed, like you basically can construct like the shade as well, right? And the problem is a lot of, say you're a company trying to sell some sort of product, you're probably more likely to invest in wealthier neighborhoods and put your kind of shade structure there and put your advertisement there, right? So what this leads to is a kind of preponderance of shade structures in wealthier, whiter neighborhoods and fewer in, say, Black, Latinx, and poorer neighborhoods where there's kind of a sense that these are not our customers, right? So what LA is trying to do now is figure out how can we build these kind of clever, newly designed kind of shade structures that maybe are a little bit cheaper, that maybe we can kind of get up a little bit faster. And the problem is they don't really work. Like, I mean, on one hand, we can kind of applaud the desire to innovate and produce new design. On the other hand, it has to actually be functional, right? And I think the way we hold LA accountable is we ask about funding, right? So I don't think the problem here is one of design. I think it's a problem of funding. So when we ask about things like public transportation and shelters for buses, who should be paying for that? And I think the answer, at least for me, is taxpayers. I think the city should be putting money that we pay in taxes into providing public transportation and shelter for for bus stands, right? Rather than saying let's have private companies pay for this, right? And that's going to shift who gets access to this and who doesn't.
Okay, Mariano asks, how has your research in India benefited your work in the heat lab? And I guess what's the connection between the two?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, in large part, or at least to an extent, the heat lab emerged out of a desire to do more collaborative work and in response to the pandemic when I couldn't travel as much and I wanted to kind of do more work here in Los Angeles. It's difficult, of course. I can't bring students to India en masse because it's expensive and because it would require a lot of training in terms of languages and so on and so forth. But the work I do in India and the work that we're doing here in the US, I think there's constant crosstalk, right? So one of the things that's been really interesting is this question about how do we ask questions about heat, right? So part of what I've learned with the work we do here in Watts and the work I've been doing in India is that in both places, you can't just ask, tell us about the heat. You have to figure out what are the specific ways in which people talk about heat. And that's been a really important lesson that's kind of traveled between the sites for me, is thinking about culturally specific ways of addressing and thinking about heat that are tied to specific histories of of bodies and foods and medicine and histories of land use and histories of kind of racialized labor and so on and so forth. So this kind of specificity, I think, has weirdly enough, that's traveled. That kind of methodological lesson has kind of moved between my work in India and my work in the US.
There are questions, comments? Okay, Alexander has a question. In your opinion, what will the future of thermal inequality and struggling for thermal justice look like, particularly in global areas like parts of South Asia, where environmental conditions are rapidly worsening due to global warming?
I mean, that's a hard question. I think it'll get worse before it gets better, you know? To some extent, the effects of climate change are baked in, at least for the foreseeable future. And so, you know, one of the things that I think is really important and underemphasized is that people don't die from heat waves. They die from a failure of an adaptation to heat waves, right? So think about what happened in Seattle a couple of years ago during there was a heat dome across Seattle, Vancouver, the kind of Pacific Northwest, which was pretty bad. And part of the reason it was so bad is because homes there are not built for extreme heat. It's not a thing that happens very often, and a lot of people don't have air conditioning. Um, if you had all of those things, the effects of the heat wave would have been far less severe, right? So now that we know that these heat waves are going to be coming and coming a lot, coming often and being severe, how then do we enact permanent transformations that'll kind of expect that, right? So, for example, what do we do about people who are unhoused? How do we provide shelter and cooling? How do we think about work and labor and energy use? How do we think about access to water and green space in parks, right? These are all things that we can do now to mitigate the effects of heat waves before they arrive. And, you know, ideally, if you do those things, there's no reason why anyone has to die from a heat wave, right? You can actually survive it if you have those kinds of infrastructures put into place. And so this is again to say, like, it's not the heat wave itself that's dangerous, it's our failure to respond to or prepare for them in the first place, especially for certain people, right? And again, this is also very much a classed and raced thing, right? It's that certain people are the ones who are made to deal with the effects of heat without the safety measures of things like shelter or air conditioning or water.
Okay, Karina asks, you mentioned Biden's executive action of allocating $2.3 billion in combating climate change in communities like Watts in your op-ed. Do you have any updates on this policy action?
No, I mean, I think it's LA is a really complicated political beast, right, when it comes to policy. Between LA City Council, state government and federal government. California specifically has a lot of there's we have a governor who's quite invested in thinking about climate change, but it's sometimes hard to enact these things on a local level. One of the most promising actions recently has been an effort to push for a right to cooling. So, you know, if you live in California, as in most places, you have a right to heating, which means that if you rent a home, your landlord has to provide heating, right? So if it gets below a certain temperature, there has to be a heater that turns on and keeps you warm enough. There is, however, no equivalent right to cooling, even though high temperatures are equally dangerous as low ones, right? And so there are currently kind of bills before the California legislature and their lawyers from LA involved in this to kind of push for a right to cooling, which would, in theory, then make it such that renters, and most people who live in Watts are in fact renters, they're homeowners, right, would have a legal right to cooling. And I think that would go a long way to kind of shifting priorities, making it possible to ensure that folks had at least cooling, like climate control within their homes, if nowhere else, right? But yeah, things have not moved at a pace that, I mean, I think this is the kind of major problem with climate change work in general, is that things aren't moving as fast as you'd want them to. And so it is kind of it's a kind of endless battle where you kind of have to keep on making the same arguments over and over and over again, and keep pushing and keep hoping that you can kind of move the ball incrementally up the hill.
Safta.
Hi, Professor. I have a question about your, I guess, methods of research. Because you mentioned like the doctors don't entirely tell you whether it was patients are coming because of heat-related illnesses, and if you ask someone, they'll be like, "Well, it was hot. It's sometimes hot. It's sometimes." It's very vague. So, like, could you expand upon? I don't think I fully understand what kind of how you go about deciphering when, like, what particularly is being caused by heat and how to address it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the problem with heat-related illnesses is that they look like a lot of other things, right? And they often look, for example, like heart attacks or strokes. And so, in order for a physician to know that someone's experiencing a heat-related illness or even a heat-related death versus, say, something else, they have to know where the person's coming from. They have to know, like, if that person, say, is a construction worker working outside in 90-degree weather for several hours without water. They need the context to know what's going on biologically, right? And that's often missing. So what happens is that when patients are admitted to a hospital, they're misdiagnosed. And the other thing is that you often have things that are you have comorbidities happening. So you have someone, say, with diabetes, heart condition, and they're experiencing high temperatures. And so that perfect storm of things makes it easy for a doctor to see the diabetes and see the heart condition, but they miss the heat element. And so what you can do is retroactively, you can use kind of big data analysis and say, well, we know that the mortality rates went up on June 15th of this year when we knew we also had a heat wave. And we know that last year, when there was no heat wave, there was far fewer deaths. So we can kind of say, well, the excess number of deaths is likely due to the increase in temperature, right? But it's harder to tell in any individual case. So when someone comes to the hospital, it's hard to say, yes, this patient's suffering from heat-related illness versus something else or some combination thereof. And this is even more complicated in a place like India, where you have a constant baseline of heat, right? At least in many places. So to really, untangle the threads and say this is heat related and this isn't, is a really difficult thing to do, and there isn't really a good way of doing it, right? This is why the data is so bad. And this is also why it's kind of interesting as a researcher to kind of think about how do we use hospitalization data and how do we kind of read against the grain and kind of say, well, how many of these heart attacks or strokes are in fact heat related and how many of them aren't, and how will we figure that out?
Raphael has a question. What do you think of UCLA joining the Big Ten in 2024 and the effects of thermal change on student athletes and other consequences? And then continues.
Is this dangerous? Will it have long-term effects? Is the UCLA Heat Lab going to study this and what the student athletes are going to experience thermal experience and shift with playing in different weather, from training in LA and playing in the Midwest and East Coast? This is a great question. I would love to. So we have been talking to UCLA Athletics to try to kind of build a relationship with them to develop this kind of work. But we're still in early conversations. But the question of sports and athletics more generally and heat, I think, is a fascinating one. We've seen at multiple Olympics and other kinds of big international events, we've seen athletes fainting on sporting fields, right? This happens with some consistency. Japan has an entire kind of research lab that they've built up in response to this, where they're trying to figure out how to acclimatize Japanese athletes before going to big global events like the Olympics. In 2028, we're going to have the Olympics here in LA, right? Is it 2028? Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's going to be a problem. We're going to see problems with extreme heat and how it affects athletes from all over the world. And something is going to have to be done about it, right? Or there's going to be issues of accountability. One of the really interesting things is an attempt to put into place like certain thresholds where they say, once it gets above a certain temperature, a certain humidity, we'll stop play because it's too dangerous. The problem with that is that bodies are not universalized, right? So somebody who's used to playing, say, in Denmark or who's used to playing in Switzerland, who then comes to play in the heat of Los Angeles summer, is not going to be ready for that, right? And they're going to have a different threshold of what's safe than someone who, say, has lived and trained in Southern California. And so these kinds of thresholds are really, really difficult to develop that work across different kinds of players with different kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of body types, so on and so forth. So I don't have an answer, but I think we're going to see this question kind of emerge again and again. We're going to see it this summer. We're going to see it in 2028. And I'm hoping it's something that we can work on as part of the our research at the UCLA Heath Lab.
So I'd like to ask you a question about your sort of remaking as a policy-oriented scholar. As you suggested, there was no course that you took, no seminar. You didn't receive training in sort of translational research, how to convert your interests into ones that would be read avidly by policymakers. So I'd like to invite you to just offer a little bit of autobiographical recollection about, the moment or moments along the path when you said, I've got to begin to engage more in applied research, really the application of knowledge to solving problems. When and how did that occur? And then when you go about your work today, this is a question that we've asked or raised periodically, whom do you imagine as your ideal audience? One of the differences between, the kind of work I began doing in my career at its beginning and now is I really do think much more concretely about who the audience is. So who is the audience, say, for the thermal inequality work? Who would be the ideal audience? Policymakers, community members, activists, all of the above. And what format or formats do you think will be most effective in conveying the impact that you want to convey?
Yeah, those are all great questions. Well, let me just begin with the first one about why I began doing this kind of more public-facing work. The real answer has to do with, I spent 10 years working on my first book through my dissertation research, postdoc, writing the book, publishing it. And, it was about antibiotic resistance, it's about tuberculosis, it's about, this thing that matters a lot to me, matters a lot in the world. And I wasn't trained in speaking about it to different kinds of audiences. So I wrote a book that I'm proud of, but it didn't have the reach that I would have hoped. And it made me kind of realize, hey, if I'm going to spend all this time doing this work, why am I not doing the work to figure out how to make it reach people where it can actually make a difference, right? And so with this heat research, from the very beginning, I was thinking, how can I make sure that I'm able to speak to people and to reach folks who can make a difference with this information, who are affected by this, who can benefit from this, right? And so that was kind of a different orientation from the very beginning, which is thinking about audience from the very start. And then in terms of kind of ideal audiences, I think it really varies. So I think a lot about how I can speak in different registers to different audiences, right? So if I'm talking, like I gave a talk a few months ago in Santa Cruz, where the mayor of Santa Cruz was there, who looks like the mayor of Santa Cruz, right? Like wears like leather jacket and skinny jeans, and I think he probably has a motorcycle or something. Anyway, but I was like, this guy has some power over how they shape the city. How I talk to him is different than how I might talk to folks in Watts when we're doing our work there, folks who already know about this stuff, and giving them a language to talk about it in a broader context, right? How I talk to, say, my colleagues in an academic journal is different. How I speak to, how I might write for the LA Times is different. How I, might do a TV interview or a podcast is different, right? So I try to kind of think about, how do I reach different audiences, and how do I kind of modify the way in which I describe my work to make it both make sense, but also feel important or relevant or salient to that audience, right? And those are going to be different. In a way, social media is great training for this because it's horrible, but it also forces you to really think about how can I effectively convey my message here in a way, I can't, social media, you don't get 400 pages. You get like 25 characters or something like that. So how do you effectively tell a story or convey a point? And then maybe kind of gesture towards other literature, right? But again, I think this is all a work in progress. As we kind of, last week I did a podcast interview, and afterwards I was like mortified. I was like, what did I say, and why did I say it that way? And how could I have been clearer about this? But you know, that's part of it. That's part of the training, is making those mistakes and figuring out, okay, here's how I can convey this more effectively. Here's how I can make sure that the message kind of reaches across, and I kind of show clearly why this historical work really matters for how we think about the present and how we reshape it, right? So I think if I have advice, it's really to think carefully about your audience, think about how you might reach them, and also be okay with the fact that you're going to mess it up and learn from those mistakes.
I think that's a great way to end, and sort of make the transition into our final breakout session, when we're going to, each of the participants is in fact going to formulate a research question and think of the best ways to disseminate and in what format. I really am grateful to you, Dr. Bharat, Venkat, for coming to the Summer Research Institute, to sharing your fascinating work, and to really offering such helpful guidance about how to go about this really important mode of analysis.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I hope you all have a great you know, I guess you have a couple of hours left, right? So yeah, best of luck with the research formulation, and you know, I'm around, so if folks ever want to talk beyond this, you're always welcome to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
So here's what I think we're going to do. We'll take a brief break, and start our final breakout groups at 1/2 past 2:30. And instead of going for whatever we had originally designated, I think we can probably get what we want done in somewhere close to a half hour. And if you tell us you need more time, that'd be music to our ears, but why don't we say a half hour? What we're asking you to do is to really formulate your research question. And I would say, as you do so, think also about the ideal audience for your question and what particular modes of communication, what formats you think would be most suitable for communicating your research results. What we want to do is sort of ask you to draw together what you've heard over the past day and a half, incorporate that into a research question which you initially surfaced in the first breakout group, and then share that idea that you have with your fellow breakout team members. So maybe a good proportion of time would be spend 10 minutes thinking yourself about the research question, the ideal audience, the formats, and then 20 minutes in conversation with one another. And again, if you feel you need more time, that's possible, more than possible. We're sort of trying to expedite or sort of distill things. And then what we're going to do after that is come back and hear from each group about the ideas that were raised, and have an opportunity to discuss key themes that emerged over the course of our time together. So any questions that you'd like to report? Yes, Saftan.
So just to clarify, each team has, or each group has one question?
No, each person has, well, that's an interesting question. Who knows what will emerge out of that collective discussion? You may decide to sort of join forces together to produce a single question, but we are interested in hearing what ideas each of you generated. So you can aggregate questions raised by the team, or you could simply have someone articulate each of the ideas that were raised by individual members. We are going to ask you to designate someone to be your reporter who can report out at the final session when we all come back together. And I hope you have clarity about that, Saftar and others. Okay, so what should we do, Rose? Should we come back at 2:30 and then break up?
So because that was our last recording, in fact, I'm going to